Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me. Let me also say thank you to Sandeep, who suggested that I rekindle our relationship and be here today as well. So thank you very much. I think to follow a session called Apocalyptic Dread is probably a good thing when it comes to the Middle East. In fact, it's probably the warm-up act in that respect. There is a serious point there, of course, which is that leaders, people do live with varying degrees of fear and anxiety. It's a condition which they have to manage on a very daily, sometimes hourly basis, especially in terms of their life. And that sense of insecurity, whether you're a leader or somebody in a community in southern Syria or in Lebanon or elsewhere or in Gaza, is very much prevalent. I also want to say that actually the title of this conference, Beyond COVID, Solidarity or Fragmentation, actually sums up what I was actually going to say. Because this is both an opportunity, but there are major challenges ahead when it comes to the Middle East. What I wanted to focus on in particular in that regard is managing change and managing change within the Middle East. The first, and let me put it in 2-3 different categories. The first is how we deal with the context. And the context, of course, is always changing when it comes to the Middle East, though conditions often do not. And certainly calm and peace is not always prevalent. Firstly, there's the outer layer. There is the global layer. And here, you can't talk about the global layer without talking about what's going on regarding the United States and its impact on the Middle East. In Baghdad, where I was, I hardly heard people talk about the United States. But at the same time, there are very high-level conversations going on between leaders, between Washington and Baghdad, in terms of a possible further withdrawal of the US and US troops from that country. And of course, in regards to Afghanistan, I was in Qatar and I saw for myself the refugees who were being housed in these facilities. They've obviously done an incredible job, but what it belies is, as we all know, a rather poorly managed US transition from Afghanistan. And I would say, I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that the bottom has fallen out now in terms of thinking that the US is very much staying in this region. That is now the psychology of the people of this region. And that links to what I said earlier about Iraq. Not many Iraqis are actually talking about the US. I stayed in the hotel across the Tigris was the US embassy. It's described as an empty castle. There are relatively few diplomats that were there. And I was there over 9/11 as well, where there was a little ceremony that you could see relatively few people were at that ceremony for such a vast complex. There is, of course, the global context of not just the United States now, as been discussed. Russia has very much raised its prestige in terms of its global power in Syria. And that is why, arguably, in 2015, it intervened, especially off the back of the criticism it was receiving for its invasion of Ukraine and, of course, Crimea in that respect. China. The Chinese always tell us in our dialogues that the Middle East is the graveyard of big powers, but inch by inch, they are getting more involved, and certainly in the Gulf, and they have interests, not least as a source of their energy, a lot of their energy, but it's not just that. Now, this is also, the Middle East is also becoming part of the geopolitical challenge and competition that we have seen elsewhere. Where that goes, I don't know. In our own dialogues, it's telling when we bring together some former representatives of Russia, the United States, China, India, as well as Europe, the main focus has been do no harm. Do no harm, and then look to see what you can do in this case. But that also presumes them continuing to talk to each other and focusing on specific situations such as the Middle East. And of course, Syria, I'm afraid, is a poster child of what happens when the international community doesn't work together, with all the vetoes that we've seen in the UN Security Council, for example. Then let me go to the regional layer. And here, maybe it's because of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and perception that the US continues to retrench. And by the way, it's not just President Biden. This is a trend which has now been going across 3 presidents, at least, despite the massive presence that the US still have militarily in the region. But there is, over the last year or so, an increasing trend of leaders talking to each other, of old rivalries and competition, not necessarily getting in the way of leaders getting together. And I'll give you some examples. There is, of course, the Baghdad conference we just had a few weeks ago, where you had, incredibly, the presidents of France as the outsider, but also of Egypt, the Emir of Qatar, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UAE, the foreign ministers of Iran and Saudi Arabia and of Kuwait, and the King of Jordan. That's a picture, if you haven't seen it, you should take a look at. But more than that, you have 3 or 4 rounds of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia taking place in Iraq. The GCC dispute effectively ended in January. And when I used to head the Brookings Institution in Doha in 2014-15, there was a continuing dispute at that time. So this is cyclical, but nevertheless, it is significant. Qatar and Egypt are talking. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are talking. Qatar and the UAE. Turkey and Egypt are talking. Turkey and Saudi Arabia are talking. And I could go on. And of course, there is Israel and the Abraham Accords, which brought the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco into a normalization with Israel. If you think about these old alliances or of competition that were there before, let's say, as exemplified between those on the Iranian side or those who talk to Iran on the Saudi side, the fact that the 2 parties are now talking is significant. If you think about the blockade within the GCC of Qatar, again, the fact that these parties are now talking to each other is significant. I don't know if some of you probably are not old enough, but I know Meccano sets. I don't even know Meccano, the sort of steel bars that you put together with bolts. Well, it's interesting. These bits of dialogue maybe are joining some bolts in some of those Meccano alliances. What structure they will build, nobody knows, and maybe it will collapse. I do give special prevalence here, actually, to the Prime Minister and the President of Iraq for convening that conference in particular. Khademi, Prime Minister Khademi, who is, we don't know if he will be if he will be Prime Minister after October the 10th, but he started something. And maybe it's the weakness, as was said to me by a senior official in Baghdad, maybe it's the weakness of the geography of Iraq that actually brought people together to see how they can actually stabilize this country. And the big idea here is socioeconomic. It's how do you connect? How can Iraq be a connective element or bolt in terms of the region when it comes to trade, when it comes to energy, when it comes to water, and other such things. And I do believe if he does come back, there are bigger plans for follow-up. They may well be already a mechanism and a structure for further dialogue in this respect. People are already talking about a Baghdad 2, or maybe the next conference being in Jordan as such. One can only hope. But again, it is significant that we've had those kinds of meetings. And again, very much at the highest level, at the leadership levels, not just between security chiefs or something like that. Having painted that picture, of course, the Middle East is a place where people are suffering. Often in my spiritual teachings, it's said that suffering is grace, but I can tell you that the suffering that goes on in the Middle East is certainly not that, or at least it doesn't seem to be at all. Let me give you a few quick figures. The World Bank's biannual poverty and shared prosperity report finds that the rate of extreme poverty in the MENA region rose from about 3.8 in 2015 to 7.2% in 2018. This is before COVID struck. Poverty rates in the Middle East are as much as 4 times higher than previously assumed. About 250 million people out of 400 million across 10 Arab countries, or about 2/3 of the total population, were classified as poor or vulnerable. And again, this is in 2019, before COVID struck. Unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, averages around 30%. In some countries, it's a lot higher. And that, again, are figures which are available through the ILO and other things before COVID took its hold. Water scarcity. It's the world's most water scarce region, with 17 countries below the water poverty line set by the United Nations. It's home to about 6% of the world's population, and yet it only has 1% of the freshwater of the freshwater resources in the world. Refugees. We all know the impact of refugees. We've seen them coming across into our own borders. A decade or more of political upheaval in the Middle East has generated levels of displacement never seen before. According to the latest report by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, an estimated 12.4 million people are currently internally displaced across the region. That's in 2021. We all know about Syria, where we've had more than 6 million refugees. And again, please remember, most of them don't make it across to Europe. They don't make it across the Channel to the UK. They are hosted in countries like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, which are very much feeling the effects of crisis themselves. Turkey, of course, not, but the others certainly. And then to add, vaccination rates, they are about 17%. 17% of the total population has received the first dose. That's higher than the average for the least developed countries, but of course it's far below what is in the more developed world. I want to point to one country in particular very quickly, Lebanon. Lebanon is going through a profound crisis where a lot of this sort of comes together. Of course, it's been long in the making. Lebanon has been borrowing huge amounts of money over the decades, more than 100% of GDP, but that has got progressively worse in the last decade, when basically remittances started to dry up. The central bank started to borrow more and more for commercial banks in Lebanon. This then started to have an impact. And at the same time, they insisted on fixing the Lebanese currency to the dollar. This started to then have an impact and is now having a profound impact. We now have a major debt crisis. The World Bank would tell you that this is probably one of the 3 worst crises since the 19th century that's going on in Lebanon today. And in 2019, we had a true collapse where the currency dropped by about 90%. 90%. So of course, that's made it much more difficult for the Lebanese state, even to buy things like fuel and medicines. And of course, fuel is heavily subsidized, but the new government of Najib Mikati has said that it's going to do away with those subsidies. And then, of course, in August 2020, we had that terrible port explosion, which for many signified where Lebanon is today. There are many sources behind it: endemic corruption, but more than anything else, a political system that just isn't working, and a political elite which has separated itself from its citizens and continues to find the most bizarre ways in which to continue to reinvent itself. What can the international community do? Well, there are talks about sanctioning some of the leaderships. There is about bringing in more donor money, but that would need to be under conditions of greater audits of the central bank and things like that. I just give Lebanon and went into it a bit more to give it as an illustration of what can really go wrong. And the final figure I'll give you is that the GDP to debt ratio is now 185%, and it's forecast to go perhaps even higher going into the future. That's the suffering. In terms of the major challenges of a conflict nature, of course, any discussion on the Middle East would be amiss if I was not to talk about the Iran nuclear deal. And here we are in a very important and somewhat precarious moment. We hoped that with the Biden administration, we would have moved back to the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, but it's proven to be a lot more difficult. In December 2020, the Iranian parliament passed a law, which I think has been quite unhelpful, which said that unless sanctions were lifted and the Biden administration returned back to the deal within a month, they would progressively diminish their own commitment to the JCPOA. Well, that's what's been happening. And it's only just a few days ago on September the 12th that in fact a major crisis was averted when the IAEA Board of Governors did not refer Iran to the Security Council because a last-minute deal was reached in terms of surveilling the Iranian nuclear, or at least surveilling through the cameras, footage which is not available. For now, we are in a state of suspended animation. We don't know when the 7th round of talks will take place, but there is hope. There is hope because both sides need it, and in fact, all sides need a nuclear deal. I believe that, in fact, we need to find more creative ways to support the so-called Track 1 process, a process which would allow the new government, the new administration of the United States, to find ways to sit and talk with the new Iranian government administration of Raisi. I believe also we should be looking for more creative ways when it comes to Gulf regional security, everything from COVID support to maritime security to perhaps other confidence building and trust building steps along the way. And again, that is being given a fair amount of thought at this period of time. The second area, of course, is conflict. Conflict still rages in Yemen. And don't think that the conflict in Syria is over. It's not. In fact, 10 years on, there is a siege of Dara in a southern town, which was actually the cradle of the start of the revolution 10 years ago. And fighting still continues. And the siege of that place and its population continues. In any case, whilst there are some efforts by certain Arab governments to seek normalization with the Assad government, Europe, United States and others remain very much of the view that we need a political process to seriously start for there to be steps for steps in that regard. Meanwhile, Syria is a hugely fragmented country today. My own colleagues work in Northeast Syria, working on dialogues between citizens in Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor and other places, trying to work on ways in where we can stabilize, at least find interim arrangements while that fragmentation continues. And remember, this is the place which ISIS established itself very securely. I'll come back to this later, but I do wonder whether we are taking our eye off the ball when it comes to Syria, whether our own governments are, and whether we are prepared enough in order to be able to continue to show commitment to a political transition and stabilization of Syria, because if we're not, if we do that at our peril. And then I think Shukri already talked about Israel-Palestine. Biden administration, as you know, and the Americans in the room certainly know, came in very much with a domestic agenda, but the Middle East has a habit of bringing itself back onto the TV screens, and no less was that the case when it came to the recent Gaza conflict. My own view, and I think Shukri started to allude to that, is that we must move towards some sort of a long-term truce, which is underpinned by international diplomacy and guaranteed by the Security Council. In the absence of that, we're not going to be able to do the things we really need to do, which is the much more people-to-people, ground-level work that needs to be done, which a lot of very innovative organizations in Israel and Palestine are starting to do now. And so one hopes that we will be able to go there. Let me finally end by saying that what are the lessons for us when it comes to the Middle East? Very quickly, this is not an exhaustive list, but certainly do no harm is important. Let's not prioritize our own interests. The Middle East has already seen Cold War I and the rivalries that played out in the Middle East, the war on terrorism, which we can discuss further if we have time, and certainly worries about a new Cold War, particularly between China and the US playing out, perhaps even in the Middle East. And I can tell you, sitting with some of the leaders in the region, the pains that they've taken to speak to both the US and China to make Afghanistan not a place for regional rivalries to play out. What must we do? We should seek political compromises. We should, as an international community, look for ways where we can help create the space for real dialogue to take place. I lament that too often that's not been the focus of international processes or international medias or our governments. We very much struggle to keep, as I said before, the attention on places and the resources that are needed. And certainly in the case of the of the UK, the cut in the aid budget, where peace building and peace support was a very tiny line, that has been further diminished as well. And our work, for example, is not supported anymore by the UK in places like northeast Syria. And then finally, I would argue for polylateralism. The United Nations and the official institutions are the captains of a team. They are not the viceroys or the sole leaders of a particular peace effort. This has to be at multi-level, whereby which local civil society, as well as outside actors, can play a very, very important role in terms of building ideas and recommendations, which hopefully contribute to real peacemaking. As we know, that's a decades-long endeavor, particularly in the Middle East. And if we look at the literature, typically a transition from conflict to peace does take 20, 30, 40 years. And the question is do we all have the stamina for something like that? I'll end finally on a hopeful note. I want to go back to those discussions between leaders and fear, because insecurity is what drives so many of those leaders. For the Iranians, it's existential. For the Saudis, it's existential. For others, too. I do hope, and here maybe thinking a little bit more spiritually, that not just fear, but what is happening and the changes and managing the change in the Middle East, leaders themselves start to build more confidence in continuing to talk to each other. In many ways, build a certain level of consciousness, not the unconscious whir of reaction, counter-reaction, of duality, but of real serious consciousness of which enables them to be able to take, even if it's very small steps, more steps towards trying to find ways in which to compromise and to build more security for themselves. I suspect that's what they're going to have to do, because the outside layer will only, I think, be led by that, or it will play a very self-interested role. If that is the case, then perhaps we will see an effort to manage change, which is for the better. Thank you.